Another great program tonight. We'll soon be favored to hear from Val Holley talking about Frank Cannon's Senate career and his impact on Utah. Val recently published the first full-length biography of Frank J. Cannon, one of Utah's most interesting characters. Book is published by University of Utah and has come out in both soft and cloth-bound versions. And our beloved Kurt Bench and Benchmark Books has copies for which he'll give you a 10% discount. I think that's about $30 for paper and about $60 for cloth bound. And so call Kurt. Our newsletter in a timely fashion. What was that? That was an echo. Our newsletter has a review of the book, Frank J. Cannon, Saint, Senator, and Scoundrel. So be sure to read that tonight. You can get a good introduction to the book. Let's introduce anyone who's visiting with us. Do we have any guests tonight?
I have three guests.
Cool. Please.
Nina Johnston and Grant Butler and my wife, Marilyn.
Great. Welcome, welcome. Nice to have you here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Frank Pester.
I invited Frank. This is Ken Johnson. I've known Frank for 25 years, and I really want to get him into this crew. I think several people here will know Frank. He's worked at Wellers for a very long time, and he's a great guy, and I'm glad to have him here tonight.
Frank, and we have your application for Westerners, and welcome, welcome. It's great to have you here with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
My father and my brother, Orville Holley and Sean Holley, are watching tonight.
Okay, cool. Welcome to be here with us. Thank you.
And I'm Todd Berlin. I'm Steve's son from Chicago. Good evening.
Oh, great. Well, you know, love your parent. Yeah, I love Steve. So anyway.
I'm Spence Kennard. I've visited with you before. I'm here as Scott Snow's guest. I don't see Scott on. He might be there, but great to be with you again. I just finished reading the Utah Sons of Utah Pioneers magazine, Pioneer, about statehood, and it reads a lot about what Frank Cannon did to get Utah into the state.
That was my article, Spence, and it's nice to have you here with us. And whether Scott's here or not, you are very welcome to be with us. Thank you.
Yeah. Not only that, you're going to get a golden hat for comments.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, that's we give you. You can come next month too if you'd like to.
All right. Thank you.
With or without
nice
Scott.
To be with you. Yeah. Thank you.
Little did you know.
Right. Anybody else? Okay. So once again, be sure to read the newsletter. There's always lots of interesting stuff in it. This month we have a wonderful biographical sketch of Rod Miller, a member of our group, of course. And I love these because I get to know more about everybody. A former Serious Rodeo participant and advertising maven who's also an award-winning Western poet, magazine writer, short story writer, and novelist who's published 16 books with many more in the pipeline. Our 2021 directory is about ready and is more likely to be finished and distributed soon when we have all or most of our members pay their dues. It's some of the leverage we have to try to get people to pay to make sure you're in the directory and you get your directories. Be sure to send your dues to Craig Smith, whose address is in last year's directory, which you should have, and you can also now do it with PayPal. Just make sure you say you're a friend, and I think you won't be charged for that. Another great announcement: Laura Baer, with some help from Linda Thatcher, is close to being done with our 50th anniversary publication. She needs some things, some photographs, and some programs, and some speaker lists that she hasn't found in all of her studies, in all of her searches yet, to help her fill in a few blanks. So look at the newsletter, see what she needs, see if you've got anything from like 2007 field trips, see if you can remember who spoke certain times and help out. This month's newsletter also has a reprint of Hal Schindler's part 1 of his columns on the Utah War. and an enormous number of useful and helpful links for people with a serious interest in Western and Utah history. Are there any announcements that any of you have that should be heard by everybody? If not, we have asked, Val has asked, and we have approved with very happy response, John Silito, to introduce our speaker tonight. And we'll turn it over to John and then Val, and then we'll listen. Thank you.
Me, one of the best things of the past few years has been getting to know Val Holley. He is cheerful, optimistic, humorous, and delightful company. More importantly, he possesses intellectual curiosity. All of these are useful for any historian who tackles tough topics, and Val has done just that. First in his fine study, 25th Street Confidential, which examines the history of Ogden's rowdiest road, and now through his examination of Frank J. Cannon. I commend to you the information found in this month's newsletter about both book and author. Let me add a few other thoughts. Both of these books are important to me as a transplanted Ogdentino. You see, I am a Salt Lake boy who for many years thought that the civilized world encompassed from North Temple to 21st South, from Redwood Road to Foothill Boulevard. I've grown to realize that the important, yet often overlooked role my adopted home has played in the Utah story for more than a century and a half. Val's book is subtitled Saint, Senator, Scoundrel. Of these, Saint seems to me to be the most problematic. As a term of of religious identification, it is accurate enough, at least for part of his life. Indeed, as Val notes, Frank tried sporadically to be a good Mormon while his father was alive. His disillusionment with the Mormon hierarchy came when he accused them of supporting the predacious interests of the early 20th century, thus becoming a religious tyranny whose goal was to increase the dividends of national plunder. I accept Senator. A quick check of the sources validates that fact. Scoundrel is also undisputed by the record. His roguish activities included morals and personal behavior, sobriety, business and finances, and public life. Theodore Schroeder, the acerbic critic of Mormonism, said that many viewed Frank J. as a man who possesses much and helps himself. A more recent assessment comes from the faithful Davis Bitton, who asserted that Cannon was always looking for a get-rich-quick scheme. It reminds me of the words of the great country singer Billy Joe Shaver, who observed, "You can bet I'm going to get my share of mine." Still, as Val demonstrates, he also used his obvious talents when in the 1890s he was enlisted to recruit friendly financiers to support the church after high-ranking Mormons had come home empty-handed. But I think there is another S to consider, son. By no means was he the only nor successful or favored son of George Q. Cannon, but that fact was at the root of his success, power, and influence. At the same time, he found himself in conflict with both father and his numerous male siblings in politics, business, and religion. In the words of the TV character Monk, it was a curse and a blessing. Another Ogdentino, Bernard DeVoto, concluded that Utah will not look upon his like again. I would paraphrase that to say historians of Utah will never look upon the road to statehood without considering Frank J. Cannon's role in that crucial transformation. With that, I give you Val Holley.
Thank you very much, John Silito, for that nice introduction. And thank you very much to the Westerners for the invitation to speak tonight and for the interest in Frank J. Cannon, Saint, Senator, Scoundrel. I will start by giving some context to Frank Cannon's short Senate career, which was 3 years, from 1896 to 1899. Now, if at first it seems like something more tailored to the Hinckley Institute of Politics than to the Westerners, I apologize. In the present day, newly elected Congresses convene on January 3rd, 2 months after the November elections. New senators are sworn in on January 3rd, and this has been the case since 1934. In the 19th century, congressional schedules were much different. In Frank Cannon's era, a new Congress technically began on March 4th, 4 months after November elections. However, unless there were a special session, Congress would not convene in the 19th century until the end of the year, on average 13 months after the November elections. This was driven in part because of the wish to avoid Washington's summer heat. A critical fact to remember is that about Frank Cannon's era is that senators were not elected by the people, but by state legislatures. Direct election by the people didn't come until 1913. Senators were elected in January, once the legislatures had convened in state capitals. By point of comparison, we are currently surviving the 117th Congress. It convened just last month on January 3rd. Now tonight, we are concerned with the 54th Congress, and that convened on December 2nd, 1895. On that date, 20 new senators who had been elected the previous January were sworn in. But Utah was not yet a state. That wouldn't happen until Grover Cleveland issued the statehood proclamation on January 4th, 1896. As statehood was approaching, Utah scheduled a special election for November 1895 to ratify its new constitution and to choose state legislators, who in turn would choose Utah's first 2 senators. The legislators elected Frank Cannon and Arthur Brown on January 21st, 1896, fully a year after the other new senators of the same Congress, the 54th, had been elected. However, when Cannon and Brown were sworn in on January 27th, 1896, they followed the other new senators swearing in by only 8 weeks. Consequently, Cannon and Brown may have had the least seniority in the Senate, but they had missed almost no significant debate or votes in the 54th Congress then in progress. Senators serve 6-year terms. The Constitution divides senators into 3 classes whose terms are staggered. Frank and Arthur Brown had to draw straws to determine which class they would join. Brown's straw put him in class 3, whose term had only 1 year remaining before Brown would have to seek re-election. Frank drew the class 1 straw, giving him a term with 3 years remaining. As fate would have it, neither of them would be re-elected. How does Frank Cannon's Senate tenure compare with other Utah senators? Well, only Arthur Brown had a shorter term, 1 year. Thomas Kearns, who you've all heard of, served just 4 years. However, since 1896, the average length of service for Utah senators has been 3 terms, or 18 years. The 3-term senators from Utah were Elbert Thomas, Jake Garn, Robert Bennett, and Frank Moss. Reed Smoot, who served from 1903 to 1933, was in for 5 terms. 30 years is an extremely long time for a senator, and yet he does not hold the record. I imagine that you all know that Orrin Hatch, who served 42 years or 7 terms, is the record holder. For the longest serving Democratic senator from Utah was William H. King. He was in from 1917 to 1941. The class 1 seat, which Frank Cannon held, is now Mitt Romney's. In a few minutes, I'm going to explain why that is poetic justice. Arthur Brown's class 3 seat is now held by Mike Lee. To win his Senate seat, Frank had to thwart a challenge from the most formidable rival Utah could possibly furnish, his father, George Q. Cannon, who was first counselor to Wilford Woodruff, president of the Mormon Church. When I was writing this book, it didn't occur to me to look into other Senate races in which a son and father might have contended against each other. Now, family dynasties are quite common in the Senate. They've been very common over the years. The current senior senator from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, is the daughter of Frank Murkowski, who was also an Alaska senator. In Frank Cannon's era, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts was very prominent. And then several decades later, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. was also the senator from Massachusetts until he was knocked out by an upstart politician named John F. Kennedy. And you all remember Al Gore. Al Gore, before being vice president, was senator from Tennessee, and his father, Al Gore Sr., was also senator from Tennessee. In none of these dynastic scenarios, however, did a parent and child challenge each other. The only scenario I've been able to find that's even close to the Cannon race occurred in 1994. Senator Trent Lott of Mississippi, who later became majority leader of the Senate, had two challengers who were father and son. Richard O'Hara took on Lott in the Republican primary, while his son, Sean O'Hara, unsuccessfully sought the Democratic nomination to oppose Lott. Lott was unbeatable, and the O'Hara's bids were hopeless. It appears safe to say that the Cannon contest is the only significant father-son Senate race in U.S. history. The story of that race is perhaps my favorite chapter of the book. As Utah moved toward statehood, a tacit political truce emerged that one of its Senate seats should be Mormon and the other Gentile. Frank had a lot going for him. In addition to his popularity in Republican circles, there was a tradition, a territories delegate in the House of Representatives, which Frank was, should advance to the Senate. But the press seemed obsessed with the notion that George Q. Cannon was going to be Utah's Mormon senator. High-ranking Mormons and high-ranking Republicans of national stature all regarded George Q. as the man who could most benefit Utah and the Republican Party. Bear in mind that back in the 70s, that is the 1870s, during his decade in the House of Representatives, George Q. Cannon had been a Democrat, like most Mormons at the time. But by 1895, he had become a Republican. George Q. Cannon wanted the Senate seat, but he was unwilling to campaign for it. The president of the Mormon Church, Wilford Woodruff, vacillated on that question. Throughout 1895, Woodruff periodically announced that it was God's will that George Q. should become the senator. But then Woodruff would back away, fearing negative publicity from expectations of church and state separation. George Q. believed that if God willed his election, God would miraculously clear away any obstacles in George Q.'s path. Now, in Frank's favor was the Republican Party's organization and strength. All 43 Republicans elected to Utah's brand new state legislature had publicly pledged to support Frank, and he in turn had pledged to be a candidate no matter who else might enter the race. Republicans outnumbered Democrats in the new state legislature 43-17. At the end of 1895, Frank was in Washington, D.C. to fulfill his duties as delegate to the House of Representatives from Utah. On December 30th, President Woodruff sent Frank a telegram asking him to sacrifice his Senate aspirations and do everything he could to get his father elected, because that was God's will. Frank stayed in Washington to be present at Grover Cleveland's statehood proclamation on January 4th, 1896, and then he hurried back to Utah. Meeting with Woodruff, he refused to break his pledge to his fellow Republicans. He proceeded with his own campaign. President Woodruff appointed a three-man committee to lobby the members-elect of the Utah legislature to back George Q for the Senate. The committee found that George Q would lose because Republican legislators feared and could not countenance explaining to constituents that church pressure had persuaded them to break pledges to Frank. George Q released a statement of non-candidacy, and Frank swept into the Senate seat. As already noted, Arthur Brown, a Salt Lake City attorney and native of Michigan, captured the Gentile Senate seat. The issue that would dominate Frank's Senate term, and sadly cripple it, was free coinage of silver. The Coinage Act of 1873 had made the gold standard official. It ended the right of any citizen to have silver bullion struck into dollar coins free of charge. By the early 1890s, a combination of drought, falling prices, and bank foreclosures had impoverished and radicalized the farmers west of the Mississippi. Farmers blamed the gold standard for chronic indebtedness because it raised the cost of credit. To farmers, free silver meant cheap money. Free silver was assumed to unhitch the dollar. I mean to say farmers wanted to unhitch the dollar from the gold standard and link it to cheaper silver. Michael Kazin, some years ago, wrote a biography of William Jennings Bryan, and it is excellent on this topic. I'm going to read a paragraph from it. Kazin writes, "Today, the passion either for free silver or the gold standard seems bizarre and naive. Few citizens of advanced capitalist nations fret that they can't convert their paper money into a tidy amount of precious metal. We may mistrust bankers and currency traders, but we are usually comfortable enough with abstract monetary values not to blame those who manage them for causing depressions. But in the mid-1890s, most Americans assumed that wealth consisted largely of products that were tangible and visible: crops, livestock, iron, coal, textiles, and real estate. Because creditors, industrialists, and the Bank of England favored gold, ordinary Americans who resented their power and often found it mystifying rallied to the promise of free silver. They were groping for a flexible currency tailored for a fast-growing economy. But they trafficked in the argot of conspiracy. For further reading, by the way, on how economic conditions in the West gave rise to the free silver movement, I recommend Bernard DeVoto's article from Harper's Magazine, August 1934, called "The West, a Plundered Province." If you're interested, I can send a scanned copy to you. I'll give out my email address at the end of the talk. Frank Cannon explained his unique devotion to free silver as follows. I had been for some years interested in the problem of our monetary system and had studied and discussed it among our Eastern bankers and abroad. I had grown into the belief that our system was wrong. It seemed to me that some remedy was imperative. I saw in bimetallism, which is defining the currency in terms of two different metals, a part of the remedy, and I supported bimetallism not as a partisan of free coinage, but as an advocate of monetary reform. In the fall of 1895, as Utah's special election to ratify the state constitution and to choose state legislators approached, the Republican Party of Utah sent its top 3 candidates. Those would be Heber M. Wells for governor, Clarence E. Allen for Congress, and Frank for the Senate, although he wasn't on the ballot, out on a lengthy speaking tour. In a series of 103 meetings across Utah territory, Frank found the sentiment for free silver to be overwhelming. The 1896 election in Utah, he wrote, was won for the Republican Party because a plurality of the people believed that the Republican Party was moving on with irresistible power to the restoration of the money of the people. But for this belief, there would have been no Republican senators and no Republican representatives in Congress from Utah. Now, Frank's understanding of Utah voters' mandate is the key to his subsequent actions and votes as a senator. 5 months after he took his Senate oath, Frank arrived in St. Louis for the Republican National Convention of 1896. For many months, rumors had abounded that silver delegates to the convention would bolt not only the convention, but the Republican Party. Frank and 2 other silver senators on the Resolutions Committee doggedly tried to get acknowledgement of bimetallism into the party platform, but they were overwhelmingly outvoted. When it was clear that the convention's general session would snub silver and adopt the gold standard, Western delegates carefully plotted their secession from the convention and the party. They assigned the composition of their statement of resignation to Frank, whose skill as a newspaper editorial writer made him the obvious choice. Frank not only wrote the dissenter's statement, but he delivered it as a speech to the general session after the designated reader, a Montana senator, chickened out. Heckling and catcalls broke out. He reminded the convention that its Minneapolis platform of 1892 had supported bimetallism. The convention chairman became so alarmed at the crowd's belligerence that he urged Frank to stop, but Frank kept on. "We hold that this convention has seceded from the truth," Frank concluded. "The Republican Party, once the redeemer of the people, is now about to become their oppressor unless providentially restrained." As the auditorium erupted in pandemonium, Frank and 22 other delegates, silver delegates, walked out of the convention. Henceforth, the press began referring to them as Silver Republicans, although they would not take steps to formally organize as a party until the following year. In the original draft of the Frank J. Cannon manuscript, my introduction was a narrative of Frank's role in bolting this convention. After all, it was the most notorious event in his public career and covered in great detail by newspapers across the country. However, when my editor, Tom Krause, read the manuscript, he found himself Googling George Q. Cannon and other topics that he, as someone not native to Utah, didn't know much about. He told me that ideally, the reader should be able to get that information from the text rather than from Google. So I discarded the Silver Republican introduction and I replaced it with a new one that addressed my editor's concerns. So the story of Frank's dramatic bolt of his party's national convention has been moved to chapter 12. The Silver Republicans made themselves official on Washington's birthday, 1897. So we are just about at the anniversary of that. They gathered in Washington, D.C. at the home of Colorado Senator Henry Teller. They named a provisional party chairman and scheduled an executive session later that year. In June of 1897, they held what appears to have been their only national committee meeting, still called provisional, and they passed resolutions for a convention and a platform that would never be realized. The contingency that sealed Frank's fate as a one-term senator was the Dingley Tariff Act of 1897. Congressman Nelson Dingley of Maine was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee in charge of revenue. William McKinley, the new president, had asked Nelson Dingley for a revenue bill to erase budget deficits. McKinley called Congress into special session. So instead of convening at the end of 1897, as usual. Congress opened in special session on March 4th, the first day of the 55th Congress. Citing lavish corporate contributions to the Republican Party, Frank Cannon took a dim view of what he knew was coming. I know the McKinley administration will have a tariff law, he said. The prospective bestowal of financial windfalls on commercial interests was in itself the decision of the election. When the smoke cleared, Frank was the only senator with Republican attached to his name to vote no on the Dingley Tariff Act. The political courage that vote required was comparable to Mitt Romney's vote on impeachment last year. Explaining his vote, Frank said, no tariff proposal backed by a powerful interest had failed to find Senate support, nor had any humble interest of the people of the United States attracted anything but rejection. The bill was prepared in the interest and largely at the dictation of the trusts and the monopolies of the US, whose representatives surged about Washington during the preparation of the measure, and some of whom were admitted to the innermost councils of the subcommittee. The Dingley bill's protective tariffs on vital Utah industries, such as wool and lead, had been demanded by important Republicans in the state. All of Utah's major newspapers called on Frank to resign. The Provo Inquirer said Frank should have resigned before ever going back on his party platform to vote against the protective bill. Even George Q. Cannon spoke out to the Salt Lake Tribune, saying that he felt Frank had made a mistake. This public expression was uncharacteristic and may have reflected some lingering jealousy over the Senate seat. Holding fast to the silver Republican refusal to support tariffs without bimetallism, Frank shrugged off the Republican platform. He reminded Utahns that, quote, the sole topic of our 103 meetings during that 1895 campaign was the silver question. The people of Utah sent me to the Senate on that question, and I defy any man to prove to the contrary. I believe that Frank's finest hour in the Senate came during debate on the Dingley tariff bill. In November 1894, before Frank was in the Senate, both he and his father, George Q. Cannon, had been Utah delegates to the Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress, which was an annual meeting held to propose legislation to benefit the South and West and forward the proposals on to the US Congress. So at that Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress, the California State Grange proposed a bounty on exported farm products to be funded by tariffs on imported manufactured goods. The Grange argued that steady declines in worldwide agricultural prices were ruining American farmers, who were not protected by tariffs on imports as manufacturers were. Frank disagreed. His position, which carried the day, was that tariffs on manufactured goods would boost domestic consumption of farm products and enrich the farmer. Now, somewhere between the Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress and the Dingley Tariff Bill 3 years later, Frank changed his mind, demonstrating an admirable malleability. Frank introduced an amendment to the Dingley bill to create an export bounty for farm products. Quote, the great class of our population who have supported the protective tariff were in a large degree excluded from any of its benefits, he said. The bill as it is offered today affords no protection to agricultural staples. I would rather see both the Carnegie and Bethlehem armor plate works closed down than to see 1 million farms sold out in the US. Senator Chandler of New Hampshire asked Frank when he first came to believe that US tariffs robbed the farmer. Just so soon as I gave sufficient attention to the subject to understand the truth of it, Frank replied. I advocated Republican tariffs as earnestly and faithfully in my humble way as the senator from New Hampshire, and I believed exactly what I taught. No man in this chamber who shall oppose the export bounty was ever more determined against it than I was. At the Trans-Mississippi Congress 3 years ago, I was full of zeal for free silver and for the Republican Party. I accepted and contended for the Republican interpretations of the tariff. And when it was put forth as a cardinal doctrine that protection on manufactured goods would eventually give efficient, substantial, and commensurate protection to the American producer of agricultural staples, I believed it. Heaven forgive me, I was instrumental in defeating the export bounty at the Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress. I looked into the question, I found I was wrong. I said that at the first opportunity, I would contend for equitable protection for the farmer of the US, who all these years had borne the burden of a protective tariff system. Frank's export bounty amendment went down to defeat. He said afterwards that he was not disappointed because the effort had been the Silver Republican Party's first move in a strategy to distinguish themselves from regular Republicans. The Silver Republicans' second move would be a fact-finding tour of the Far East to study the monetary systems of Japan and China. Japan had recently adopted the gold standard, while China continued with silver currency. Frank, with Senator Pettigrew of South Dakota and former Senator Du Bois of Idaho, spent 6 weeks in the Far East. And he stopped briefly in the Hawaiian Islands on his way back to the States. The topic of the hour in Hawaii was whether the US would annex it. With Pearl Harbor 47 years in the future, it is fascinating to see Frank's take on Japan's attitude towards Hawaii. Before he sailed to the Far East, Frank had regarded rumors of Japan's designs on Hawaii as just things cooked up by the island's annexation club to manipulate Congress. But, quote, I discovered that the Japanese government had been very much in earnest in its intention to seize Honolulu, with the ultimate result of extending the Japanese sovereignty over the whole group. There is no doubt whatever in my mind on this point, and I can produce proofs. Now, the other two senators opposed the annexation of Hawaii. When the Japanese statesmen learned my fellow senators' attitude on this question, they were pleased, Frank recounted. When I was at times so placed in our conferences that I was forced to explain that I differed from my associates as to Hawaii, there was always a clouding of the brows across the table from our delegation. Frank would vote with the Senate majority for annexation of Hawaii in July 1898. I'd like to say a couple of words about Frank's renowned skill as a speaker. In January 1898, the Senate debated a Silver Republican resolution that US bonds should be payable in either silver or gold. Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts introduced a competing resolution to pay bonds only in gold. Contentious debate was inevitable. Frank declared he would vote for the Silver Republican resolution if only to announce to the nation's creditors that the US would honor its obligations. He was at his best that day, eloquent in advocacy for silver's parity and extemporaneous in disparaging its detractors. Among the targets of his sarcasm were, quote, the magnificent logician from Kentucky, or the Indiana senator who, by virtue of his genius, is the mouthpiece of the administration upon financial questions, and others who represent the states of the Far East, whose integrity they are so fond of vindicating each day and almost each hour in this chamber. That silver Republican resolution easily passed the Senate thanks to a coalition of Democrats, populists, and silver Republicans. But the House's Republican majority defeated the same resolution by 50 votes. Shortly after Frank left the Senate, his friend Senator Pettigrew of South Dakota wrote to him about the senator from Indiana, who was Senator Beveridge. Recently, quote, undertook to make a speech in favor of retaining the Philippines for the profit there was in it. I would have given $100, Pettigrew told Frank, to have had you in the Senate to answer the fellow. He needs a thorough flaying, but I had not the command of language to warrant me in tackling the job. By the time Frank was up for re-election in January 1899, Utah's legislature had veered heavily Democratic. The Democrats' strong pro-silver outlook did not translate into support for a silver champion like Frank, who was not a Democrat. Frank was reportedly so demoralized at his failure to persuade his aunt, Democratic State Senator Martha Hughes Cannon, to support his re-election bid that he slunk out her back door. He had solid support from the legislators of Weber County, the seat of his power, but not the rest of Utah. As fate would have it, Democrats were unable to unite on any of the front runners. When the danger of a deadlock loomed, the Mormon hierarchy arranged for George Q. Cannon to be a last-minute candidate. But not even the venerable George Q. could capture a majority of the legislature. For the next 2 years, this Senate seat from Utah remained empty. In 1901, Thomas Kearns was elected to fill the last 4 years of the term. Now for some conclusions. Frank fatefully chose the wrong political home for a silver partisan in the late 1890s. He had trusted that his fellow Republicans would maintain the approval for bimetallism expressed in their 1892 platform. But in 1896, the Republican platform scuttled silver. If Frank had been a Democrat, he would have been right in line with the free silver boom embodied in William Jennings Bryan's Democratic presidential candidacy that year. It might be argued that when Utah achieved statehood in 1896, it had not figured out the kind of senators it genuinely wanted. The federal government had Utah thoroughly bamboozled by the time it became a state, owing to the difficulties involved in resolving conflicts over polygamy. As one of many gestures of appeasement to the nation, Utah had agreed that its Senate seats should be allocated to one Mormon and one Gentile. But after just a few years, Utah realized that with its predominantly Mormon voter rolls, it no longer needed to make that accommodation. Before that realization, 3 of Utah's first senators served less than 1 term, and the 4th, Joseph Rawlins, lasted only 1 term. It may well be that Utah would have been happier if George Q. Cannon had been elected in 1896 instead of Frank. The longevity in the Senate of Mormon apostle Reed Smoot from 1903 to 1933 is an indication that this was the kind of senator Utah was looking for. That concludes the presentation. If any of you have questions that you think of that you would like to ask, my email address is my initials, vh3001@gmail.com. Once again, that's vh3001@gmail.com. And I can send a copy of the Bernard DeVoto article that I mentioned, The West, a Plundered Province, if you'd care to read it. Thank you very much. I think the Westerners has time for some questions if you have them.
Please, let's have some questions.
I've got one. Let's see here. I've got one. Sorry.
Hi, Kurt.
Can you hear me? Hi, how are you?
Well, thank you.
Good. Thanks for that. That was very informative. And of course, I've already told you that I really enjoyed your book, and hopefully we'll have a lot of the members of the Westerners also enjoy it. And I have a feeling I know where they can get it. But
indeed you do.
I didn't hear much about, I mean, you obviously on a subject that big, you have to focus. But can you just say a little bit about the actually animosity between Frank and church leaders such as Joseph F. Smith, and the conflicts with his own father, and that aspect, in his books that he wrote? I think that's fascinating. And I think some of these, you just take a minute maybe and let them know, because not everybody knows Frank Cannon's story. Maybe just tell them a little bit about that dynamic, if you don't mind.
I can. It's very difficult. And I think there are people with us tonight who would agree that it was very difficult really to know what was going on in Frank Cannon's mind. One of my outside anonymous readers of the manuscript was Will Bagley. He told me he was. And Will Bagley's 3 pages of comments on the manuscript were just basically one long expression of bafflement. Who is this guy? What makes him tick? So in answer to your question, I guess I would say I can tell you what Frank wrote. And he had expected his father, George Q. Cannon, to succeed to the presidency of the church. And he says that he believed that if his father had been president of the church, he would have been more scrupulous about keeping pledges which had been made to the government for Utah to become a state, such as the cessation of polygamy. Frank claimed to believe that it was only Joseph F. Smith who was willing to contravene those pledges. And he was, as you well know from what we discussed tonight, Frank was not the kind of person who would go along politically with commercial interests. He was very determined to vote in accordance with what he thought was fairness to the little guy. And when he believed that the church was allying with corporations, he didn't like that. And I think that goes a long way to explaining the animosity.
Thank
So
you.
Val,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes,
As
Greg,
you were
Greg
writing-
Thompson. Hi.
Good to see
Good
you.
to see
Thank
you.
you. As you were writing this, and as you concluded and did your copy editing, how did it strike you as a comparative piece to our contemporary times? And do you have comments about that?
It's just, to me, it's amazing the parallels between contemporary times. For example, I have been, in the course of preparing this presentation, I was thinking about how the Eastern establishment of the Republican Party must have regarded the drive for free silver in the West. I wouldn't be surprised if the Eastern establishment thought of free silver as QAnon. I also see in today's Tribune that there may be a movement, a groundswell for censuring Mitt Romney for his vote on impeachment last week. And as you saw, every major newspaper in Utah called for Frank Cannon's resignation after he voted no on the tariff bill. So I do very much see parallels with what's happening today.
Thank you. I'd like to note Will Bagley's with us tonight. Thanks for being here, Will.
I'm very pleased. Good to see you, Will.
Glad to be back.
Val, this is Spence Kennard. Just
Hello,
talking
Spence.
about modern times, as you talked about senators and their offspring who also became senators, you didn't mention Wallace and Robert, who now Bob didn't succeed his father. He followed Jay on, but was there a reason why he's not included in your father and
I was just
offspring
giving,
senators?
Well, you're absolutely right. Maybe I should have given a Utah example here, but the examples I gave, I thought were quite illustrative, that this happened all over the country and that it's quite typical in the history of the U.S. to have family dynasties in the Senate. But now here's a thing. I guess I don't know how close in age the father and the son, Wallace and Robert Bennett, were, but is it even conceivable that at one point they could have contended against each other for the Senate seat? Can you imagine? I think everyone here remembers them. Any case, I saw another hand raised.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, as you know, I wrote a blurb for your book.
Thank you very much.
How did Frank reconcile himself to his father's close association with various national business leaders?
I am not really sure how he did, but there were times, you recall that I mentioned that George Buchanan told the Salt Lake Tribune that he was disappointed in Frank's vote on the tariff bill, and that he felt Frank was too closely identified with the other Silver Republicans. He was too closely following Senator Teller of Colorado and Senator Du Bois of Idaho. And when the Tribune asked Frank for his reaction to that, he simply smiled. And he said, "I return with the utmost feeling my father's kindly regards for me." So I think that he would have been likely to smooth it over in such a fashion.
I think you're probably right.
Get back to your computer.
Question from Mark Bodell here.
Hello, Mark.
Yeah, hi. Hey, can we talk a little bit more about the actual silver coinage? So what they still were minting silver dollars and half dollars and quarters and dimes through the whole affair, I'm assuming. Is that correct?
I have to express my bafflement on this. As I was preparing to give this presentation, I read what it said about the cessation of the silver standard in 1873, and yet I know, because I own some, that there were silver dollars minted in that period. So I must confess to you all, I'm baffled. I don't get it. We need we need a treatise on free silver by an economist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I had a question about
Yes.
when Frank lost his seat in the Senate, and you said it remained open until Thomas Kearns was appointed. But Thomas Kearns wouldn't have been representing a Mormon interest. You said that one seat was, to be represented by a Mormon and one by a non-Mormon. So did that mean that Utah had two non-Mormons in the Senate at one point?
Yes, that's a good point. The question is from Sandra about Thomas Kearns. And by the time Kearns got in, one senator, the Democrat, was Joseph Rollins, who was a lapsed Mormon. And then the other one, of course, was Thomas Kearns, who was not a Mormon. I suppose he was a Catholic. By that time, Utah was a state, and I suppose that already the idea of strictly observing that notion at the first that one had to be Mormon and one had to be Gentile was not really the case anymore. Although there are some sources that say that Kearns did have the backing of Lorenzo Snow and the Mormon Church.
That's true.
Yeah.
He did.
So you could say that that Kearns did have the approval.
Right. And then the other thing about the free silver and
Yes.
minting silver coins, I think part of it might have been that you could actually show up at the US Mint with your gold and they would create coins for you, but with the new regulations you couldn't show up with your silver anymore and have it minted into coins. But I think the government was still using silver.
That sounds possible. And of course I couldn't get into this tonight, but there were federal laws enacted, the Sherman Silver Act, where it required the government, even if they weren't coining bullion, it required the government to purchase big amounts of silver every month during the early 1890s. So yes, it was there.
Now, the issue was the exchange of silver to gold at 16-1, and that's what the Republican Party opposed.
And so was the price of
it had a little bit to do with higher crops and the fluctuating of crop prices too. So they were fighting kind of a little battle between gold, silver, and crop prices. So it's not quite as simple as we're presenting the case as I see it. A little more on that, please, with farmers and crops and crop prices.
And so was the government controlling the price of both gold and silver?
I don't know that they were. I really don't know the answer to that. There were heavy price fluctuations back and forth, but I'm not able to say what the reason was.
There was also a huge depression in the early part of the 1890s, 1893 or 4.
Yes, the Panic of 1893.
Okay. So there's all these other things too. So it's not just silver and gold and crops. It's everything kind of breaks down and then it tries to fix itself. So sometimes we talk about things that are in certain little areas and everything is so complicated and it's hard to figure anything out.
Well, and another area for the West was the depression for cattle and the cattlemen. Huge.
I can offer a little light on this. What the West wanted was the exchange of silver to gold at a ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. And the market rate about that time was about 20 to 1. And so if the 16-1 had been adopted, it would have been inflationary. That is, and that's essentially what the West wanted. They wanted silver to be to have a higher value and to be exchanged at that higher value.
Thank you.
It was also used to control inflation, the value of the dollar.
The resistance to that was an effort to control inflation. If you overvalue silver in the exchange, it's inflationary.
I think that's true. The thing that I always used to enjoy, and I would show this to my classes as a visual aid, for many, many years, a dollar was a silver certificate. It said that it was backed by silver. Now it's backed by the Federal Reserve Board. So our faith is in the fact that somehow, somewhere, those boys will make sure that this piece of paper is worth $1. I don't remember exactly when they went from saying it was a silver certificate to a Federal Reserve note, but they did. And then as someone said, it is it's a complicated time. So many things going on at one time. And part of what's going on there is the desire of a lot of folks to an alliance of workers between urban workers and agricultural workers. And if you look at the populist platforms for 1896, they are full of all kinds of references to issues that would appeal to urban workers, 8-hour day, regulation, all kinds of things. So on the one hand, they're trying to build this coalition, and they also saw the federal government as the agent to bring about change. They wanted to be able to bank in post offices, as an example. And so it is a complicated series of events or forces that's going on in that period. And maybe we'll have a better sense of it.
Both farmers and workers were pro-inflation historically. Yes. And so the effect of that 16-to-1 ratio on encouraging inflation drew their support.
Well, my old grandfather was a populist. He was born in Nebraska. Saw William Jennings Bryan throwing campaign buttons off the back of his train. And he used to say to me, boy, when he ever said boy, I knew there was a teaching moment coming. And he would say, boy, why are people poor? I'd say, I don't know, Grandpa, why are people poor? He'd say, people are poor because they haven't got money. Okay, I said. As a result, he said, if you print pieces of paper and give them to people, they'll have money and they won't be poor anymore. Now, he didn't quite understand the subtleties of inflation and that sort of thing, but he honestly believed, like many populists believe, that it was a way of fighting against the powerful Wall Street interests. There was a whole lot of anti-Semitism in populism. And ultimately, when the system was able to split black workers and white workers, I think they were onto something there in terms of power.
John, I've heard you tell that story before, I think on a street corner, and I was secretly hoping tonight that we would hear that from you, and you did. Good.
On a street corner, was I on a soapbox too?
Oh, actually, it was during a historic house story in Ogden.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have your hat in hand, John?
I'm trying to unmute. I don't know, Greg. I don't know what I have in my hand.
More questions?
Ken, it might be back in your court here.
Well, Val, this was wonderful. The presentation was fascinating. Lots of good questions that you responded well to. Lots to learn about. You should all read this book. There's lots to learn in this book through his whole life. I mean, one of the great contributions Val has made is that Frank Cannon, a lot of people know about Frank up through publication of the Under the Prophet in Utah in 1911, and then he kind of drops off, and he actually had a very robust career after that in Denver and on national speaking circuit, and Val does a nice job with that. So you should read the book, and thank you very much. It's nice. Let's have a little hand for Val Holley. Thank you for doing this. The next month we're going to have Utah Westerner Roy Webb talk to us about steamboats on the Green and Colorado rivers. How's that sound? As the teaser in the newsletter suggests, the Green and Colorado rivers in eastern Utah have a unique history of travel by powered boats and barges from the late 19th century until well into the 20th century. Side wheelers, paddle wheelers, and other types of boats powered by gasoline and steam engines, roared and clattered up and down the Green and Colorado from Green River to Moab with varying degrees of success. So Roy, who's our great expert on the rivers, is going to talk about a little something different next month. Be sure to join us. It'll be March, let's say the 16th, it'll be March 16th, exactly a month from today. And we invite you, please mark your calendars and plan to attend. And get your dues in. Let's get the directories out and keep moving forward. Thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Val.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to
Wonderful
see everyone. Thank you
presentation.
very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Val.
Good night. Thank you.